Hello, everyone. Welcome to TSAM Digital. My name is Anna, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Jackie Sanz. She's the Managing Director for Risk and Compliance at Protiviti. Hi, Jackie. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here with us. Thank you so much for making time. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about compliance. So of course, compliance is becoming increasingly complex, particularly for asset managers who want to provide services across multiple jurisdictions. So I was
Yes.
wondering, what can compliance, more specifically even chief compliance officers, do to effectively manage the risks?
That's a great question, Anna. It is true that compliance is becoming increasingly complex. And as you pointed out, the more jurisdictions you operate in, the more, complexity and layers of challenge, really. So what can the Chief Compliance Officer or CCO do to manage the risks? Well, the reality is if we step back, just operating in one local jurisdiction is not without its own challenges. Let's be clear, it's not just because of multiple jurisdictions. But when you add in multiple jurisdictions, each bringing in their own regulators, their own unique regulatory frameworks, different levels of expectations, it compounds that challenge for the CCO. So CCOs typically like to use global or what I call firm-wide policies and standards, because these are really good tools, quite frankly, that are necessary to manage risk at an enterprise level. Because as we know, in the asset management business, your risk comes at all levels, right? In the stock picking, in the front office, in the operations, all over the place. So establishing firm-wide policies and standards are pretty critical. So now multiple jurisdictions, multiple regulators, multiple expectations, it becomes, difficult. It's a challenge. So, I mean, to me, the single most important thing that a CCO should be doing is designing and implementing a robust, and I emphasize robust, regulatory change management process. Like anything that's subject to regular change, you really need to control the change. So in that framework or in that process, you need to be able to identify emerging regulatory requirements, obviously track when they come in, effective dates, transition dates, etc. You need to be able to communicate to the business, to the first line of defense or the risk owners. But you need to do that very timely because you need to give them enough lead time, right, to identify what those particular rules and regulations mean in terms of that business or risk owner's landscape, so they can identify emerging risks. And more importantly, they can develop a plan to mitigate them and consult with the CCO. There's nothing worse than, the first line doing their own thing and then compliance coming in afterwards, right? To say, sorry, you missed the boat. The other, probably two other key items that really should be in this regulatory change management process, I would say, is constant reassessment of regulatory risk, but at that firm level. Because while a rule may change in, jurisdiction B, it doesn't mean it doesn't impact multiple jurisdictions. And the reason why I say that is we all know asset managers don't work in a vacuum. So they may all be located in one country, but they are serving clientele across all of the jurisdictions. So, whatever they do to address one country cannot impact, from a negative perspective, I mean, what they do for the clients in another jurisdiction. So there needs to be this constant assessment and reevaluation of regulatory risk at the firm level. And then, of course, compliance, the CCO, needs to adapt its own business unit, right? It's got to revisit its compliance programs. It's got to ensure that they still are targeting these new and emerging risks, that they're still adequate and effective. So really, while I say go ahead, implement a regulatory change management process. Let's be real, that's not that easy to do. So that in and of itself is a challenge. And the key is how do you go about doing this and ensuring you have the right skills, the right people, the right number of resources, et cetera, to even do this. So quite thankfully, and I know this is a buzz term, but thankfully there are tons of reg tech solutions out there to do this. Now, of course, I say reg tech, I can imagine panic already. Millions of dollars, like we just can't afford that, right? It's going to cost all kinds of money to do it. The reality of it is there is so much out there right now in terms of options and solutions. But the most important thing to realize is that these reg tech solutions, they come with a library. They come with rules across whatever jurisdictions, across whatever sectors and types of registrations you have. Asset managers are sometimes also launching commingled investment vehicles, so they have the regulatory framework from that, not just being an asset manager. So buying libraries is expensive. Having a reg tech solution that brings the change management, brings the library, and brings easy, let's call it dashboards, for you to quickly see what's changing where and what aspect of your business does that impact. That is something that needs to be seriously considered in terms of the opportunity cost, right? Because there's lots of other things that have to happen to make that happen. And sometimes it makes the reg tech solution, in air quotes, cheaper. Now, I will say standing up reg tech solutions sometimes intimidates CCOs. And the reality of it is there's so much out there that leverages new technology. So, bots, machine learning, AI, et cetera. And these providers do it all for you. They will stand it up for you. They will support fine tuning. And the more sort of machine learning and AI that's embedded in the program, the less manual fine tuning a CCO would need to do to the process, right? And so that saves time. That also saves the need for resources, the cost associated with resources for somebody to constantly be fine tuning. So I would say, yes, you need a change management process in place, but you very much as a CCO need to invest or think about investing at minimum in a reg tech solution that brings that whole robust process. The other thing too to keep in mind with that is, remember that a reg tech solution brings with you the record management. It creates the records. It tracks all the activities that are going on. It helps communicate to the business. It helps track what the business is doing, assessing gaps, what are their remediation plans. So all of these things, if you don't have a solution for it, that's people, that's resources, that's time you need to invest, right, into that process, which all has its own costs associated with it, and it affects the capacity of the compliance team. So again, to me, I think it's a lot that was just said, and it's a big investment, but I would really strongly suggest that for regulatory change management being so critical to manage this complexity, an investment in some form of a reg tech solution, it's almost a must. It's almost table stakes. It's not absolutely required, but particularly if you operate in multiple jurisdictions, it's really the proper way to go. So in my opinion, and I say this as a former CCO, this is pretty much table stakes. Certainly the change management process is, but if you don't have a tool, then you need the right number of staff, appropriate skill sets, and libraries and libraries of all the regulatory rules that exist out there.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because also the speed at which the regulatory system and landscape is evolving is presenting unique challenges for us managers, right? So yes. How can firms really keep up and effectively manage risk?
So that's a great point, and it's a great carry on from what I was just saying. You're right. The speed at which all the regulators are pumping out rules. And quite frankly, the landscape, the perspective and frameworks regulators are coming up with is evolving rapidly. I would add one element to that. It's not necessarily consistent. While there is the greater IOSCO and many jurisdictions, in Europe, in North America, and even in APAC, collaborate, the rules are not the same. The thresholds and the expectations are not the same. There's a lot of similarities, but they're just not the same. So the speed at which it's all coming at and the complexity we just talked about moments ago really do present risk management challenges. And I know personally that the need to stay on top of what regulators are doing and what it might mean for the firm is a big deal. But it's really only the first step in kind of, a long, not maybe steep, but hopefully not too steep flight of stairs, right, for the CCO. And this is where, again, building these processes like the regulatory change management I just spoke about previously, and incrementally adding, whether that's through RegTech or not, doesn't have to be, needs to be done in a very methodical way, like going up a flight of stairs. But each item is dependent on the step below. So, as I said, in the former question there, you need to constantly reevaluate risk. And so long as you feel comfortable that you have addressed the regulatory change management, that you know what the rules are, that you know what rules actually apply to you, which business or risk owners it affects, what workflows are being impacted by these new regulatory requirements. So all those things that you would have done in the first couple of steps, so long as you know that you have that foundation, then really you need to come up and look at, how do I evaluate the risk? And so this is where you need a risk management framework. Not necessarily a RegTech solution, although there are many RegTech solutions specific to risk management. But the key is you need to develop a framework that makes sense for your organization. And you would look at, what types of products do we offer? What kind of services? Is it institutional? Is it retail? Do I have investment funds? Do I have exchange traded funds versus private funds? Do I have alternative investments? What is the product suite that's going to affect your framework? And once you've sort of come up with that framework, you need to put it in action. And this is where the action, so now we're still going up the steps now of this flight of stairs. This is where the action is critical, because it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be consistently applied across the organization. And most importantly, it needs to happen on an ongoing basis. As we talked about before, regulation can change anywhere. And maybe you'll get a new client in a new country all of a sudden. So now you've introduced automatically another jurisdiction. So it's very important that methodology, that framework for evaluating risk is defined. It's got its own workflows, and it is designed for agility, scalability, and sometimes speed, right? It depends on how quickly your business evolves. And I will say, not that I'm trying to plug RegTech, there are RegTech solutions out there. And unlike the regulatory change management, I don't think it's table stakes, but the larger you are and the more sort of complex your risk management framework is, you're probably going to want RegTech. And I say that for the same reasons I said before. Otherwise, you need to figure out, how many resources do you need? This is something that would be very much full-time type work. So, what's that going to cost you? Do they have the right skills? How can they interact with your business? If your business works in multiple time zones, you got to be able to deal with risks come up 24/7. It's not a kind of 9 to 5 market time matter, right? So it's critical to think about all of these things and determine your resources, whether RegTech is the right way to go for it. But I would also say, remember that risk management isn't sitting in one business unit. It permeates the company. So whatever solution, whatever framework you do design and implement, it's got to coexist with regular operational workflows, however you are structured, whether you've got third-party service providers, internal providers. It needs to permeate the organization and allow for the collection of the data that you need to determine, are controls being circumvented? What does that mean for risks? Is a risk in a particular area that perhaps is triggered, how is that impacting other areas of the business, right? Because often risks have cascading effects, right? The risks are not in their own little silo box. So it can get really complicated, and RegTech is not the answer for that. You need to understand your business, but the RegTech can facilitate the documentation, right? And the tracking of it all, and making sure the business units, as they make adjustments, aren't creating what I call unintended consequences, right? They may decide to create a particular control here, but that could have another effect elsewhere, upstream or downstream, and that can create issues. So I would say that what can the CCO do? The CCO really needs to work very closely with all the risk owners, and if there happens to be a risk group, with the risk group. But this framework needs to be designed. It needs to be constantly tested and updated as the company evolves and as the risk profile, right, of the organization, not just regulatory, but product and business related risks evolve over time. So it's a lot to say. I would sum it up in a nutshell that no matter what challenges you face, you're going to need robust, repeatable, sustainable, measurable, and documentable processes to deal with that, be that regulatory change or be that risk management.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I found it really fascinating, especially the part about risk not being a 9 to 5 thing, and it doesn't live in a box, which it really definitely doesn't.
No. And business owners live in their universe, right? And they may not realize the impact they're having on the other business units in an organization, right? Typically, the front office knows what's happening in the front office, and the only time they interact with the middle and the back is typically when there's an issue. Trade doesn't settle, right? Something fails. They don't like the valuation of the security. Otherwise, everybody works in their silos. But that's not how risk works, right? Risk is something that's over top of all of these activities, and each business activity impacts, it's all integrated, right? Will impact other risks. It's complicated.
I know, right? I mean, I find it really wonderful how you've explained it, because it puts it in a different perspective. And I really think that our audience will appreciate that. So it's been really a great pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anna, for having me.